The organisation undoing tax abuse, OUTA, has gone to court to overturn last week's declaration of a national state of disaster over our electricity crisis. The urgent application was filed today in the North Gauteng High Court to interdict the state of disaster. I'm joined now by Wayne Duvenage, Executive Director of OUTA. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us. On what grounds do you want to stop the state of
Well, it's a number of grounds. We believe the Disaster Management Act does not include occurrences that can be dealt with effectively in other national legislation. I mean, we've got the Energy Regulation Act, the National Energy Regulation Act, and the Public Finance Management Act. And all of these give government the powers, the necessary powers to deal with the various issues that they have to deal with. We have an energy plan in place. And the biggest issue here is implementation. The IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan, in 2019 is another plan that determines our security for long-term planning of our energy needs, and government just keeps missing the boat on implementing it properly and updating it. So we certainly believe that a state of disaster, if it's declared, especially on the speculation of of a blackout, is unfounded. We've looked at the Eskom's energy plan. In fact, it was presented to Parliament 2 days before the State of the Nation and the announce of the disaster or the state of disaster, and nowhere in there, and nowhere can we see either that Eskom has been consulted and discussed this plan with, and they have to be, because they are the people who are going to deal with the energy crisis as we have it now. So there's a number of factors, and the alarming issue for us and the real concern is that a state of disaster opens the door for, as we saw during COVID-19, rampant corruptions, abuse of power, and the ability to shoe in disastrous decisions such as the Karpowerships one, which we're also in court on. So there's a number of reasons, Sally.
Okay. So, I mean, if we look at the definition of the Act, they say a disaster is defined as, and I quote, a progressive or sudden, widespread or localized, natural or human-caused occurrence which causes or threatens to cause disruption and is of a magnitude that exceeds the ability of those affected by the disaster to cope with its effects. So certainly, even though it's human-made and, you know, the fingers of blame pointing at state corruption, at the ANC policies, etc., that doesn't actually matter. The reality is it's still creating a disastrous situation. But you're saying the Act does not include events that can be managed by existing legislation. Fair point. There is an energy action plan. We have a crisis committee. The reality is, though, that's been in place for some months, and things have actually got worse in that time. The President this afternoon was really pointing to the fact that they need to speed everything up, and that the declaration of a state of disaster is going to allow them to do that, making the point, though, that it will be a transparent process. Don't you think on the need for speed alone, they've got a point?
No, there's nothing to stop them to introducing a need for speed right now, Sally. They have got all the laws in their favor right now to progress, to move forward, to introduce emergency procurement through the Public Finance Management Act. They don't need a state of disaster. What the state of disaster does is it negates the need to circumvent some hurdles, of which is rationality. And imagine signing us up to a 10-year or 20-year deal with Karpowerships because the state of disaster allows that to happen, and we have a noose around our neck on a massive plan that could sink this country. And that's what can happen in a state of disaster. So nothing precludes them from moving quickly and swiftly. Right now, the biggest problem is this is a 15-year man-made disaster or government-made crisis that we're in right now. And they need to start implementing. It's simple. The plan that has been presented to Parliament and to the NACOM, the National Energy Crisis Committee, is there. They've signed that off. They've looked at it. And nowhere in there does they say, is there any situation that brings the process of a blackout under normal circumstances any closer right now. In fact, we're now down to level 4s and going into level 2s. And You know, you don't need a disaster to deal with sabotage. You don't need a state of
Well,
disaster
you know,
to
just
deal
jumping
with
in on the
corruption.
sabotage, I mean, just to jump in on that, because that is an interesting point. Eskom just sending out that press release this afternoon saying what has happened in Gauteng, specifically around the Rand Water sabotage issue, because it relates back to sabotage at Eskom. They say it's reached disastrous proportions. I mean, it seems almost that we're dealing with like a low-grade war on essential infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's how bad it's sounding. We know that there's army deployments already around some power stations, but isn't a state of disaster needed to deploy more army around more essential infrastructure? And are we not really at that point?
No, we didn't need a state of disaster for government to make the decision, as they did a number of weeks ago, to deploy the army. And they must do that. And they must deploy every mechanism possible to deal with the sabotage, not only at the power stations, but as you see, in substations, in towns and municipalities. And what they need to do is get the South African police together with communities, together with a number of entities, to start tackling rampant corruption and vandalism that is taking place on water, on so many fronts. This is a crisis that has been developed over a number of years due to poor governance. Poor government has put us in this position. And unless we fix competence and accountability and transparency in government, which we've been calling for years now, you're never going to get on top of the disasters that are happening in every municipality with wastewater treatment plants malfunctioning. That's a big disaster as well. But you can't call a state of disaster for water treatment plant issues. We need competence in government. And our biggest disaster, managing and putting in charge to manage critical parts of our country that just have no idea of what they're doing. The road accident fund has been plundered. I can go on and on, Sally.
You can,
That's
yes.
the real issue.
So let's get, I do want to ask you about the Karpowerships issue, because I know that OUTA has been really on the front foot on this and actually was instrumental in getting that original deal off the table, which was a 20-year deal. Was it a 20-year deal? Gosh, that's a long time. Ted Blom was on the show recently, energy analyst. He thinks we actually might need a power barge or two in the very short term just to help us through this period. Isn't a state of disaster exactly the flexibility government needs to perhaps bring in something like a power barge? Because not everyone is dead set against it. Some people say, look, for a very limited period of time, it might be necessary.
Yeah. So we're not opposed to those solutions either. In fact, if government came forward with a plan to have the Karpowerships in for 3 years to mitigate the current constraints, and the pricing was right, and there was some level of environmental impact assessment, we're not going to object to that. The problem is they came with a 20-year deal at prices that were pre the Ukraine war, which was going to cost us 220 billion rand. We put that closer to R500 billion over 20 years. So we're not opposed to short-term actions. And the other thing is, Karpowerships is not one of those things that's going to dock tomorrow and start providing electricity. It's going to take over a year to set up. In the meantime, we've lost a whole year of getting IPPs and other solutions into the system, which would have alleviated the current problem now. So government really has been dragging its feet, but we're not opposed to a Karpowerships deal that makes sense for the country. A 3-year deal would be to 5 years max, but not at 15 times the price that it should be.
All right, sir, you were in court today. We await the next steps in your court action. Thank you so much, Wayne Duvenage, Executive Director of the organisation Undoing Tax Abuse, and they have taken the state of disaster over our electricity crisis to court. They want an urgent application to have it overturned. Now,